Welcome to a tale that will challenge everything you think you know about desire, social boundaries, and the human heart. This is a story that unfolds in the shadows of antebellum America, where passion knows no social class, and one woman's awakening will change everything forever. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more captivating stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The autumn of 1847 arrived at Hawthorne Plantation like an unwelcome guest, bringing with it the kind of restless energy that seemed to seep into the very walls of the grand estate. Margaret Hawthorne stood at her bedroom window, watching the Spanish moss sway in the humid Georgia breeze, her reflection ghost-like against the glass. At 32, she had perfected the art of existing without truly living. Her marriage to Charles Hawthorne had been arranged when she was 19, a union that brought together two prominent families and secured her father's tobacco investments. What it hadn't brought was love, passion, or even basic companionship. The Hawthorne mansion rose majestically among the centuries-old oaks, its white columns like silent sentinels guarding secrets that would never be revealed. Built by Charles's grandfather in 1798, the property stretched over more than 1,000 acres of fertile land, where hundreds of enslaved people worked from dawn to dusk, cultivating cotton that enriched the Hawthornes, while they themselves remained in misery. Margaret knew every room of the house as well as she knew the lines of her own hand. The main parlour with its grand piano, imported from Vienna, which she played for guests at soirées that dragged on for interminable hours. The library with its thousands of leather-bound volumes, where she took refuge when loneliness became unbearable. The rose garden she cultivated with obsessive dedication, as if she could find in the flowers the beauty that was missing from her life. The morning had begun like any other, in the endless succession of identical days that comprised her existence. She had awakened alone in her vast four-poster bed, the space beside her cold and undisturbed. Charles maintained his own chambers at the opposite end of the hall, an arrangement that had been established early in their marriage under the guise of propriety, but which Margaret suspected had more to do with his complete lack of interest in her as a woman. "Mrs. Hawthorne," came the soft voice of Lily, her personal attendant, "Master Charles requests your presence in the dining room." Margaret turned slowly, her emerald silk dress rustling against the hardwood floor. Lily, barely 20, with kind eyes and gentle hands, had been her only source of genuine human connection in this house of cold marble and colder hearts. The young woman had been born on the plantation, daughter of the head cook, and had been assigned to Margaret's service when she turned 16. In the 4 years since, she had become more than a servant. She was perhaps the closest thing to a friend that Margaret's isolated existence allowed. "Thank you, Lily. Please tell him I'll be down momentarily." As Lily departed with a small curtsy, Margaret caught sight of herself in the ornate mirror that dominated one wall of her chamber. The woman staring back was beautiful, in the way that society demanded. Pale skin unmarked by sun or labor, auburn hair perfectly arranged in an elaborate chignon, posture rigid with years of deportment lessons. Her dress, made from silk imported from France, fit her slender figure perfectly, emphasizing her narrow waist and the gentle curve of her shoulders. But her green eyes held something that no amount of social training could disguise, a deep, aching emptiness that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. The dining room stretched before her like a cathedral of loneliness. The mahogany table, which could seat 20 guests during the elaborate dinner parties that Charles occasionally hosted, seemed to emphasize the distance between the two place settings at opposite ends. Charles sat in his customary position, his attention buried in correspondence from his cotton broker in Savannah. At 45, he remained handsome in a distinguished way, his graying temples lending him an air of authority that served him well in business. His morning coat was impeccably tailored, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, every inch the successful Southern gentleman. In marriage, however, authority was a poor substitute for affection. "Margaret," he said without looking up, his voice carrying the same tone he might use to address an overseer, "I'll be traveling to Charleston next week. The Pemberton Plantation is for sale, and I'm considering expanding our holdings." She took her seat at the far end of the table, the distance between them feeling like an ocean. The fine china before her, part of a set that had belonged to Charles's grandmother, seemed to mock her with its delicate beauty. Even the food, prepared by the skilled hands of the kitchen staff, tasted like ash in her mouth. "How long will you be away?" she asked, cutting into her breakfast with mechanical precision. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. He finally glanced up, his blue eyes assessing her with the same detachment he might show a piece of furniture he was considering purchasing. "You'll manage the household affairs, of course. Overseer Johnson will handle the field operations." Margaret nodded, though the prospect of Charles's absence filled her with a complex mixture of relief and dread. Relief because she would be free from the suffocating pretense of marital harmony. Dread because his absence would leave her even more isolated, even more aware of the emptiness that defined her existence. "There's something else," Charles continued, folding his letter with crisp efficiency. "The Ashfords are hosting a gathering next month. You'll need to attend. It's important for our standing in the community." "Of course," she replied, though the thought of another evening spent smiling and making pleasant conversation about nothing of consequence filled her with a familiar despair. These social gatherings were a particular form of torture for Margaret. She would spend hours preparing, selecting the appropriate dress, arranging her hair, practicing the gracious smile that was expected of a lady of her station. And then she would stand in elegant parlors, surrounded by other plantation wives, discussing the weather, the latest fashions from Charleston, the health of various relatives, while carefully avoiding any topic that might be considered controversial or, God forbid, interesting. The men would retire to smoke cigars and discuss business, cotton prices, politics, the management of their human property. The women would remain in the parlor, their conversations as carefully choreographed as a minuet, each word chosen to maintain the delicate balance of social hierarchy that governed their world. After Charles departed for his study, Margaret found herself wandering the halls of Hawthorne House like a spectre. The mansion, built by Charles's grandfather, was a testament to Southern grandeur. 12 rooms, soaring ceilings, and windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. But grandeur, she had learned, was a poor companion. The day unfolded in its usual pattern of elegant tedium. She supervised the work of the house servants, reviewed the household accounts, and spent an hour in the garden instructing the gardeners on the care of her roses. Each activity was performed with the perfection expected of the mistress of a great plantation, but inside, Margaret felt as if she were slowly drowning in a life that wasn't her own. During lunch, she found herself gazing out the dining room window at the enslaved people working in the distant fields. They were small figures in the landscape, bent over the endless rows of cotton, their lives reduced to units of production in Charles's ledger books. Margaret rarely thought of them as individuals. She had been raised to see them as part of the property, no different from the horses or cattle. But today, for some reason, she found herself watching more closely. There was a young woman working near the house, carrying baskets of freshly laundered clothing. Her movements were graceful despite the heavy work, and when she smiled at another worker, her entire face lit up with a genuine joy that Margaret hadn't felt in years. The woman couldn't have been more than 22, with skin the color of burnished copper and hair that caught the sunlight like spun gold. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the strength in her movements, the pride in her bearing despite her circumstances. There was something about her that drew the eye, something that spoke of an inner fire that no amount of oppression could extinguish. As Margaret watched, a young man approached the woman. He was tall and lean, with the kind of build that came from years of hard labor, but there was something in his posture that suggested he had not been broken by his circumstances. When he spoke to the woman, her face transformed with such obvious affection that Margaret felt a sharp pang of something she couldn't quite name. Envy. Longing. She wasn't sure, but the intensity of the emotion surprised her. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke as she reached the library. Rain lashed against the windows with increasing fury, and thunder rolled across the plantation like the voice of an angry god. Margaret pulled a book from the shelf, Wuthering Heights, which she had read countless times, and settled into the leather chair by the window. But the words blurred before her eyes as her mind wandered to the life she might have lived. In her girlhood dreams, she had imagined a marriage filled with laughter, shared secrets, and, yes, passion. She had imagined a husband who would look at her the way Heathcliff looked at Catherine, with desperate, consuming need. Instead, she had Charles, who looked at her the way one might regard a well-maintained piece of property. The afternoon stretched endlessly before her, each minute marked by the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Margaret tried to lose herself in her book, but the familiar words seemed to mock her with their passionate intensity. How could she read about Catherine and Heathcliff's all-consuming love when her own marriage was nothing more than a business arrangement dressed up in the trappings of respectability? As evening approached, the storm intensified. The wind howled through the ancient oaks, making the branches scrape against the mansion's windows like skeletal fingers trying to get in. Margaret attempted to concentrate on her needlework, but her hands trembled slightly, making the delicate stitches uneven. She dined alone, as was becoming increasingly common. Charles had taken to eating in his study when he was absorbed in business matters, leaving her to sit at the vast dining table with only the silent servants for company. The meal, roasted chicken with herbs from her garden, fresh bread, vegetables from the plantation's fields, was expertly prepared, but it might as well have been sawdust for all the pleasure it gave her. After dinner, she attempted to play the piano, but even the music that usually provided some solace seemed flat and lifeless tonight. Her fingers moved mechanically over the keys, producing technically perfect renditions of the pieces she had learned as a girl, but there was no soul in the music, no passion. Margaret retired early, claiming a headache, though the truth was she simply couldn't bear another evening of stilted conversation and Charles's distracted attention. She dismissed Lily and prepared for bed alone, braiding her long auburn hair and changing into her white cotton nightgown. The nightgown was beautiful in its simplicity, fine cotton trimmed with delicate lace, cut modestly to cover her from throat to ankle. It was the kind of garment that spoke of refinement and propriety, but as Margaret caught sight of herself in the mirror, she wondered what it would be like to wear something designed to entice rather than conceal. But sleep eluded her. The thunder seemed to echo the restlessness in her chest, and she found herself pacing her room like a caged animal. The air felt thick and oppressive, despite the rain's attempts to cool it. The restlessness that had been building within her for weeks had now become almost unbearable. It was as if something was awakening in her chest, something wild and hungry that she didn't know how to name or satisfy. Near midnight, unable to bear the confinement any longer, Margaret wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the hallway. The house was dark, save for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the portraits of long-dead hawthorns lining the walls. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her as she made her way toward the back of the house, seeking the small parlor that faced the gardens. The floorboards creaked softly under her bare feet, and she paused occasionally, listening for any sound that might indicate Charles was still awake. But the house was silent, except for the storm raging outside and the steady tick of various clocks marking the passage of time. It was there, as she paused before the tall windows that overlooked the plantation's working areas, that her world shifted on its axis. The external kitchen, a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway, glowed with warm candlelight. Through its windows, Margaret could see two figures moving in what she initially assumed was the simple business of late-night meal preparation. But as her eyes adjusted to the scene, she realized she was witnessing something far more intimate. The young man was Samuel. She recognized him now, one of the field hands, perhaps 25 years old, with the kind of strong, lean build that came from years of hard labor. His skin was the color of polished bronze, his muscles defined by constant work under Georgia's merciless sun. There was a dignity in his bearing, even in his most intimate moments, that spoke of a spirit that refused to be broken by circumstances. The woman was Rosa, who worked in the main house kitchen. Margaret recognized her by the reddish-brown hair she always kept in a simple braid, and by the light eyes that seemed to sparkle even during the most humble of tasks. Her skin was luminous in the candlelight, her movements graceful despite the humble surroundings. Margaret knew she should turn away. Everything in her upbringing, every lesson in propriety and social order, screamed at her to retreat to her room and forget what she had stumbled upon. But something held her frozen at the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched. Samuel's hands moved with infinite tenderness as he traced the line of Rosa's face, his touch reverent, worshipful, His fingers were calloused from years of fieldwork, but they moved over Rosa's skin with the delicacy of a master craftsman handling precious silk. When Rosa leaned into his caress, her eyes closing with an expression of pure trust, Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest, a longing so sharp it was almost physical pain. This was what she had read about in the forbidden novels she kept hidden beneath her mattress, books that had been smuggled to her by a sympathetic cousin who understood the suffocating nature of Margaret's existence. This was what the poets wrote about, what made women in stories risk everything for love. This raw, honest intimacy that seemed to transform the very air around the couple. Margaret pressed closer to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The glass was cool against her fevered skin, and she had to grip the window frame to steady herself as she watched the scene unfold before her. She observed as Samuel pulled Rosa into his arms, their bodies fitting together with the ease of long familiarity. When he kissed her, it wasn't the perfunctory peck that Charles occasionally bestowed upon Margaret's cheek during their rare moments of physical contact. It was consuming, desperate, full of a hunger that Margaret had never known existed. Rosa's hands tangled in Samuel's hair as she responded with equal fervor, her body arching against his with an abandon that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. They moved together like dancers who had rehearsed this choreography 1,000 times, each touch, each caress, speaking of a connection that went far beyond the physical. Margaret should have been scandalized. She should have been thinking of the impropriety, the violation of the natural order that her society insisted upon. The very foundation of her world was built on the premise that such intimacy between people of different races was not only forbidden, but unnatural. Instead, all she could think was, "This is what I've been missing. This is what I've been dying for, without even knowing it." When Samuel began to unlace Rosa's simple dress, his movements slow and reverent, Margaret knew she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. She should leave. She should run back to her room and pretend this moment had never happened. She should report what she had seen to Charles or Overseer Johnson, as any proper Southern lady would be expected to do. But she couldn't move. She was transfixed by the sight of two people who, despite having nothing, no wealth, no status, no freedom, possessed the one thing that all of Margaret's privilege couldn't buy: genuine, passionate love. Rosa's dress fell away, and in the golden candlelight, her body was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or artifice. Her skin seemed to glow with an inner light, and every curve spoke of a woman who was comfortable in her own flesh, who had never been taught to be ashamed of her body's natural responses. When Samuel's hands moved over her skin, Rosa's soft moans carried through the night air, and Margaret felt an answering heat bloom low in her belly, a sensation so foreign and overwhelming that she had to grip the window frame even tighter to keep from falling. She watched as they came together with an intensity that made her legs weak. This wasn't the dutiful, mechanical coupling that she had experienced in her marriage bed during the early months of her marriage, before Charles had lost even that minimal interest in her. This was fire and need and complete surrender to something larger than themselves. Margaret's own body began to respond in ways she had never experienced. Her skin felt too tight, too warm. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Between her legs, she felt a throbbing ache that was both torment and promise, a sensation that her strict upbringing had never prepared her to understand or address. The white cotton of her nightgown suddenly felt restrictive, and she found herself pressing against the window, desperate for some relief from the heat that was building within her. Her free hand moved unconsciously to her throat, then lower, as if seeking to ease the strange new sensations that Samuel and Rosa's passion had awakened. When Rosa cried out in ecstasy, her voice carrying across the storm-swept night, Margaret bit her own lip to stifle the sound that threatened to escape her throat. She was witnessing something sacred, something that belonged to these two people alone, and yet she couldn't tear herself away. The intensity of Rosa's pleasure was unlike anything Margaret had ever imagined possible. The woman's entire body seemed to convulse with sensation, her back arching as waves of ecstasy washed over her. Samuel held her through it all, his own face transformed by a mixture of tenderness and desire that made Margaret's heart ache with longing. As the couple lay entwined in the aftermath, their bodies gleaming with perspiration, Margaret finally found the strength to step back from the window. But the damage was done. The image was burned into her mind, into her very soul. She stumbled back to her room on unsteady legs, her entire body trembling with a combination of shock, shame, and something else, something that felt dangerously like awakening. The hallways that had seemed so familiar suddenly felt foreign, as if she were seeing them through new eyes. That night, Margaret lay in her cold, empty bed, staring at the ceiling as the storm raged outside. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Samuel's hands on Rosa's skin, heard Rosa's cries of pleasure, felt the echo of their passion like a phantom touch on her own neglected body. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret touched herself, her inexperienced fingers seeking the source of the ache that Samuel and Rosa had awakened. The sensations were overwhelming, foreign, and yet somehow familiar, as if her body had been waiting her entire life for this moment of discovery. When release finally came, it was with Rosa's name on her lips and tears streaming down her face. Tears of relief, of grief, of a longing so profound it threatened to consume her. She had glimpsed paradise, and now she would have to find a way to live knowing it existed just beyond her reach. But even as her body found temporary satisfaction, her mind remained tormented. What she had witnessed wasn't just physical passion, it was a spiritual connection, a union of souls that she had never imagined possible. And now that she had seen it, how could she go back to living without it? The storm continued to rage outside, but inside Margaret's heart a different kind of tempest had begun, one that would change the course of her life forever. The days following the storm passed in a haze of barely contained chaos. Margaret moved through her daily routines, overseeing the household staff, attending to correspondence, maintaining the facade of the perfect plantation mistress, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying that night over and over like a fever dream. Charles had departed for Charleston as planned, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and the terrible new knowledge of what she had been missing. Without his presence, even the pretense of normalcy became difficult to maintain. "Mrs. Hawthorne, are you feeling well?" Lily asked one morning as she helped Margaret dress. "You seem distant lately." Margaret caught sight of herself in the mirror and was startled by what she saw. Her usually perfect composure had developed cracks. Her eyes held a wild, hungry look that no amount of powder could disguise, and her hands trembled slightly as she attempted to fasten her jewelry. "I'm fine, Lily. Perhaps just tired from the heat." But she wasn't fine. She was consumed by a need she couldn't name, couldn't satisfy, couldn't escape. Every night, she found herself drawn back to that window, hoping to catch another glimpse of Samuel and Rosa together. Most evenings, the external kitchen remained dark and empty, leaving Margaret to return to her room frustrated and aching. The waiting became a form of exquisite torture. She would stand at that window for hours, her body pressed against the cool glass, watching for any sign of movement in the kitchen building. When nothing happened, she would return to her bed more restless than before, her mind conjuring images of what might be happening in the privacy of Samuel's quarters. On the rare occasions when she did see them together, sharing a quiet meal, Rosa mending Samuel's shirt while he read to her from a worn Bible, Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions that she struggled to understand. There was envy, yes, sharp and bitter. But there was also something else, a vicarious pleasure in witnessing their happiness, even as it highlighted the emptiness of her own existence. She began to study them during the day, finding excuses to walk past the kitchen gardens where Rosa worked, or to inspect the fields where Samuel labored under the merciless Georgia sun. She learned their routines, their habits, the way they stole glances at each other when they thought no one was watching. Rosa was perhaps 22, with intelligent dark eyes and a quick smile that she shared freely with the other house servants. She moved with an unconscious grace that made even the most mundane tasks, kneading bread, hanging laundry, look like a form of dance. Margaret found herself envying not just Rosa's passionate relationship with Samuel, but her very ease in her own skin, her ability to find joy in simple pleasures. There was something about Rosa that drew people to her. Margaret noticed how the other servants sought her out during their brief moments of rest, how children gravitated toward her warmth. She had a way of making even the hardest work seem bearable through her gentle humor and infectious optimism. Samuel was quieter, more reserved, but Margaret noticed the way his face transformed when Rosa was near. The hard lines of exhaustion and resignation would soften, and for a moment he would look like what he was, a young man in love, despite the circumstances that should have made such love impossible. Margaret learned that Samuel could read, an unusual skill among the enslaved population. She discovered this when she saw him teaching a group of children their letters in the evening, using a piece of charcoal to write on a flat stone. The sight filled her with a complex mixture of admiration and guilt. Admiration for his determination to educate himself and others, despite the laws forbidding such activities, and guilt for the system that made such simple human dignity a crime. It was during one of these covert observations that Margaret made a discovery that changed everything. She had been walking through the herb garden behind the kitchen when she heard voices from the small cabin that Samuel shared with two other field hands. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see Rosa sitting on the edge of Samuel's narrow bed, her head in her hands. "I can't keep living like this," Rosa was saying, her voice thick with tears. "Always looking over our shoulders, always afraid. What if Master Charles finds out? What if—" "Shh," Samuel interrupted, pulling her into his arms. "We'll find a way. I promise you, Rosa, we'll find a way to be free." Margaret's breath caught. They were planning to run away. "The Underground Railroad," Samuel continued, his voice low and urgent. "There's a conductor in Savannah. If we can get there, and if we're caught—" Rosa's voice was barely a whisper. "You know what they do to runaways." Margaret knew too. She had heard the stories, seen the advertisements for escaped slaves in the newspapers, complete with descriptions of the punishments that awaited those who were recaptured. Whippings, brandings, sometimes death. The penalties for seeking freedom were designed to be so severe that few would dare attempt escape. The thought of Samuel and Rosa facing such a fate made her stomach turn. But more than that, the thought of them leaving, of losing the only source of genuine passion and life she had discovered in her sterile existence, filled her with a panic that was almost overwhelming. That night, Margaret paced her room like a caged animal, her mind racing with possibilities. She could report their plans to Overseer Johnson. It would be the expected thing to do, the proper thing according to the social order she had been raised to uphold. Charles trusted her to maintain order in his absence, and allowing valuable property to escape would be seen as a serious betrayal of that trust. But the thought of betraying them, of being responsible for destroying the only real love she had ever witnessed, was unbearable. How could she condemn two people whose only crime was loving each other and wanting to be free? Alternatively, she could do nothing, let them attempt their escape, and live with the knowledge that she might never see them again, or worse, that they might be caught and punished because she had failed to help them. As dawn broke over Hawthorne Plantation, Margaret made a decision that would have shocked her former self. She was going to help them escape. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was feeling, what she wanted from this situation. The truth, when it finally crystallized in her mind, was both simple and terrifying. She didn't just want to help Samuel and Rosa find freedom. She wanted to find her own freedom through them. She wanted to know what it felt like to be touched with reverence, to be desired with desperation, to surrender completely to passion without thought of consequence or propriety. She wanted, God help her, to experience what she had witnessed that stormy night. The following days were a torture of anticipation and planning. Margaret began to gather supplies discreetly, money from her personal allowance, non-perishable food, a detailed map of the routes to Savannah. She studied the schedules of the guards, the patrols that Charles had established to prevent exactly the kind of escape she was planning to facilitate. More importantly, she began to observe Samuel and Rosa with new intensity, memorizing every detail of their interactions, the way Samuel touched Rosa's arm when he passed her in the courtyard, how Rosa smiled when she thought no one was looking, the small gestures of affection they exchanged even under the watchful eyes of the overseers. It was during one of these observation sessions that Margaret noticed something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the nature of love. She was hidden behind a trellis of roses in the garden when she saw Rosa approach Samuel, who was repairing a fence nearby. But instead of the quick, furtive kiss that Margaret expected, Rosa simply placed her hand over Samuel's and whispered something in his ear. The expression that crossed Samuel's face was one of surprise, then something that looked like hope. They looked toward the main house, their eyes seeming to search for something or someone, and then Margaret realized with a shock that made her stagger that they were looking at her, not directly, but at the window from which she had watched them that first night, as if they knew she had been there, as if they knew she was still watching. The realization hit her like lightning. They knew about her. They knew she had seen them, knew she had been watching. And somehow this hadn't frightened or angered them. Instead, it seemed to have intrigued them. Margaret's hand shook as she gripped the rose trellis, thorns biting into her palms. How long had they known? What did they think of her voyeurism? Were they disgusted by her behavior? Or, and this thought made her heart race, were they perhaps as curious about her as she was about them? That evening, as she stood once again at her window, Margaret saw something that confirmed her suspicions. Samuel and Rosa were in the kitchen, but they weren't alone in their passion. They were performing, moving deliberately into the light, positioning themselves so that anyone watching from the main house would have a clear view of their intimacy. They knew she was watching, and they were putting on a show for her. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. What did it mean? What did they want from her? And more importantly, what was she prepared to give? Margaret's opportunity came sooner than expected. Charles sent word from Charleston that his business would keep him away for an additional week, and Overseer Johnson had taken ill with a fever that confined him to his quarters. For the first time in her married life, Margaret found herself with real authority over the plantation and the privacy to act on her dangerous impulses. She waited until evening, then made her way to the external kitchen where she knew she would find Rosa cleaning up after the day's meal preparation. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached, but her resolve held firm. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the lingering scents of the evening meal: roasted pork, fresh bread, herbs from Margaret's own garden. Rosa looked up in surprise as Margaret entered, her dark eyes widening with what appeared to be concern rather than fear. "Mrs. Hawthorne, is everything all right? Do you need something?" For a moment, Margaret's carefully rehearsed words deserted her. Standing this close to Rosa, she could see the fine sheen of perspiration on her skin from the heat of the cooking fires, could smell the faint scent of lavender soap that she used. This was the woman who had unknowingly awakened something primal and desperate in Margaret's carefully controlled world. "I know about your plans," Margaret said quietly, watching as Rosa's face went pale. "I know you and Samuel are planning to run away." Rosa's hand stilled on the dish she had been washing. When she spoke, her voice was carefully neutral, but Margaret could see the fear flickering in her eyes. "I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Hawthorne." "Please." Margaret stepped closer, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to help." The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. Finally, Rosa set down the dish and turned to face Margaret fully. "Why would you help us?" Rosa asked, and there was something in her voice, a note of curiosity rather than suspicion, that gave Margaret hope. It was the question Margaret had been dreading, because the honest answer was too complicated, too shameful, too revealing. How could she explain that watching Rosa and Samuel together had awakened a hunger in her that threatened to consume everything she had been taught to value? How could she admit that she envied Rosa, not just for her love, but for her very capacity to feel so deeply? "Because what you have with Samuel is beautiful," Margaret said instead, and it was true even if it wasn't the whole truth. Because love like that shouldn't be caged. Rosa studied her for a long moment, her intelligent eyes searching Margaret's face for deception. There was something almost predatory in her gaze, as if she were a hunter sizing up her prey. "And what do you want in return?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret could lie, could pretend that her motives were purely altruistic, but something in Rosa's direct gaze demanded honesty. "I want to understand," Margaret whispered. "I want to know what it feels like to be truly alive." Rosa's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something that might have been recognition. "You've been watching us." It wasn't a question. and Margaret didn't try to deny it. Yes. For how long? Since the night of the storm. Rosa nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. I thought I felt eyes on us sometimes. Samuel said I was imagining things, but I knew someone was there. Margaret's cheeks burned with shame, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. I know it was wrong, I know I had no right, but I couldn't stop myself. Because you've never felt what we feel. No, Margaret's voice broke on the word. Never. Rosa moved closer, her movements slow and deliberate. When she reached out to touch Margaret's face, her fingers were gentle but sure. Margaret gasped at the contact. It was the first time in years that anyone had touched her with such tenderness. Your husband doesn't love you, Rosa said, and it wasn't a question. No. The admission felt like a physical wound. He doesn't even see me. Not really. And you've never been with anyone else? Margaret shook her head, not trusting her voice. The very idea of being with someone else had never occurred to her. Marriage was supposed to be forever, a sacred bond that couldn't be broken. But what was sacred about a union devoid of love, respect, or even basic human connection? Rosa's thumb traced the line of Margaret's cheekbone, and Margaret felt her knees go weak at the simple contact. You want to know what it feels like to be desired? Yes, Margaret breathed. To be touched like you matter. Yes. To feel your body come alive under someone's hands. Margaret's breath hitched. Yes. Rosa's hand moved to the back of Margaret's neck, her fingers tangling in the auburn hair that had escaped from its careful arrangement. I could show you, she said softly. If that's what you really want. Margaret's world tilted on its axis. This wasn't what she had expected, wasn't what she had planned. She had imagined helping them escape, perhaps earning a grateful kiss from Rosa, a moment of connection that would have to sustain her through the empty years ahead. She hadn't imagined this. Rosa's dark eyes heavy with invitation, her body close enough that Margaret could feel the heat radiating from her skin. I don't understand, Margaret whispered. Rosa smiled, and it was gentle but knowing. You think Samuel is the only one I love? The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. You and Samuel, and you also. Love isn't always simple, Mrs. Hawthorne. It doesn't always fit into the neat little boxes that society tries to build for it. Margaret's mind reeled. She had spent weeks envying Rosa for her relationship with Samuel, never imagining that Rosa might be capable of loving more than one person, of finding beauty and connection in unexpected places. But Samuel knows, Rosa finished. We've talked about it. About you. About me. Rosa's smile widened. Did you think we didn't notice you watching? Did you think we couldn't see the hunger in your eyes? Margaret felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. You've been watching me watch you. Yes. And Samuel knows? He's the one who suggested I approach you tonight. As if summoned by his name, Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway. Margaret spun around, her face flaming with embarrassment at being caught in such an intimate conversation. But Samuel's expression held no judgment, only a gentle understanding that somehow made everything worse. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said quietly, stepping into the kitchen and closing the door behind him. Rosa told me about your offer to help us escape. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Up close, Samuel was even more impressive than she had realized. He was tall and lean, with intelligent eyes, and hands that spoke of both strength and gentleness. There was something in his bearing that suggested he had not been broken by his circumstances, that somewhere deep inside he remained free despite his chains. That's a dangerous thing you're proposing, Samuel continued. If we're caught, if anyone discovers you helped us. I know the risks, Margaret said, though she was beginning to wonder if she truly understood the magnitude of what she was contemplating. Samuel moved to stand beside Rosa, his hand finding hers with the easy intimacy that Margaret had observed from afar. And Rosa told me about your other request. Margaret wanted to disappear into the floor. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have... Don't apologize, Samuel interrupted gently. There's nothing wrong with wanting to feel alive. He looked at Rosa, and some silent communication passed between them. Margaret watched, fascinated, as an entire conversation seemed to take place without words. Finally, Rosa stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and Margaret. "We leave tomorrow night," Rosa said. "There's a boat in Savannah that will take us north, but tonight—" She reached for Margaret's hand, her touch sending electricity up Margaret's arm. "Tonight, if you want, we can show you what you've been missing." Margaret's breath caught. "Both of you?" "Both of us," Samuel confirmed, his voice warm and sure. Margaret looked between them, this couple who had somehow seen into her deepest longings and offered her not just escape from her empty existence, but a taste of the passion she had never known. They were offering her one night of genuine connection before they disappeared from her life forever. The proper thing would be to refuse, to help them escape and return to her cold marriage bed, with her virtue intact and her curiosity forever unsatisfied. But Margaret was tired of doing the proper thing. She was tired of being proper, period. "Yes," she whispered, and felt her old life crack apart like an eggshell. "Yes, I want that." Rosa's smile was radiant as she took Margaret's hand. "Then come with us." They led her through the darkness to Samuel's cabin, a small structure that housed 3 field hands, but was currently empty except for Samuel. The space was humble, rough wooden walls, a dirt floor, a few simple furnishings, but Rosa and Samuel had transformed it with candles and wildflowers picked from the fields. Margaret's hands shook as Rosa began to unlace her dress, each loosened tie feeling like a step away from everything she had been and towards something entirely new. The silk gown that had taken her maid an hour to properly arrange fell away like a discarded skin, leaving her standing in only her chemise and corset. "You're beautiful," Rosa whispered, her hands gentle as they worked to free Margaret from the constraints of her undergarments. "So beautiful, and you don't even know it." When Samuel's hands joined Rosa's in undressing her, Margaret thought she might faint from the overwhelming sensation of being touched with such reverence, such desire. These were hands that knew how to worship a woman's body, how to coax pleasure from skin that had never known anything but duty. "Are you afraid?" Samuel asked, his voice soft with concern. Margaret considered the question. She should be afraid. She was about to commit adultery with 2 people who were considered property under the law. If they were discovered, the consequences would be catastrophic for all of them. But fear wasn't what she felt. Instead, there was a sense of rightness, of finally coming home to herself after years of exile in her own life. "No," she said, and meant it. "I'm not afraid." What followed was a revelation that shattered every assumption Margaret had ever held about her own capacity for passion. Under their patient, skilled guidance, she discovered that her body was capable of sensations she had never imagined. That pleasure could be so intense it bordered on spiritual experience. Rosa's mouth was soft and knowing, her touch both gentle and demanding. She seemed to understand Margaret's body better than Margaret herself, finding places of sensitivity that had never been explored. When Rosa's lips traced a path from Margaret's throat to her breast, Margaret arched beneath her with a cry of surprise and pleasure. Samuel's hands were strong and sure, his kisses deep enough to drown in. He moved with the confidence of a man who understood the art of love-making, who knew that true pleasure came from patience and attention rather than haste and force. Together they showed Margaret what it meant to be truly desired, truly cherished, truly alive. They took turns pleasuring her, sometimes working in concert, sometimes allowing her to focus on the unique gifts each brought to their intimate dance. Margaret learned that her body was capable of multiple peaks of pleasure, each one more intense than the last. She discovered that the act of giving pleasure could be as intoxicating as receiving it, that the sight of Rosa's face transformed by ecstasy or the sound of Samuel's deep groans of satisfaction could send waves of arousal through her own body. When it was over, Margaret lay between them, her body humming with satisfaction and her mind reeling with the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had crossed a line from which there could be no return, had tasted something that would make her previous existence seem like a pale shadow of life. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," Rosa replied, pressing a soft kiss to Margaret's shoulder. "For giving us our freedom." "And for letting us give you yours," Samuel added, his arm tightening around her waist. They talked quietly as the night wore on, sharing stories and dreams that none of them had ever spoken aloud before. Margaret learned that Rosa had been born free in New Orleans, but had been kidnapped and sold into slavery when she was 12. Samuel had been born on a plantation in Virginia and had taught himself to read by studying his master's discarded newspapers. "What will you do when you reach the North?" Margaret asked. "Samuel wants to become a teacher," Rosa said, her voice warm with pride. "He has such a gift for it." "And Rosa wants to open a bakery," Samuel added. "She makes the most incredible bread you've ever tasted." Margaret felt a pang of envy at their certainty, their shared vision of a future built on love and mutual support. What did she have to look forward to? More years of empty marriage, of social obligations that meant nothing, of a life half-lived? As dawn approached, they made their final preparations. Margaret provided them with money, supplies, and detailed directions to the safest route to Savannah. She also gave them something else: forged papers declaring them to be free persons of color, documents that might mean the difference between life and death if they were stopped. The papers had been surprisingly easy to obtain. Margaret had simply copied the format from legitimate documents in Charles's files, using her considerable skill with calligraphy to create convincing forgeries. It was another crime to add to her growing list of transgressions, but she felt no guilt about it. When the time came to say goodbye, Margaret felt as if her heart was being torn from her chest. These two people had given her more in one night than she had received in 13 years of marriage. They had shown her who she could be, what she was capable of feeling. "Will I ever see you again?" she asked as they prepared to leave. Rosa cupped her face gently. "Maybe not in this life, but you'll carry us with you, and more importantly, you'll carry what we've awakened in you." "Don't go back to sleep, Margaret," Samuel said, using her first name for the first and last time. "Don't let them put you back in that cage." They disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Margaret standing alone in the cabin that still smelled of passion and possibility. As the sun rose over Hawthorne Plantation, she walked back to the main house, her steps steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. Charles returned from Charleston 3 days later to find his wife transformed. Margaret still performed her duties as mistress of the plantation, still attended social functions, and maintained the facade of respectability. But there was something different about her, a confidence, a vitality that hadn't been there before. "You look well," Charles observed over dinner on his first night back. "The time alone seems to have agreed with you." Margaret smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had tasted freedom and would never again be satisfied with chains, even golden ones. "Yes, I found it quite enlightening." She began to make changes, small at first. She started a school for the children on the plantation, teaching them to read and write, despite the laws forbidding such education. She improved conditions in the slave quarters, ensuring better food and medical care. When Charles questioned these changes, she met his objections with a steel in her voice that he had never heard before. "These are human beings, Charles," she said, during one particularly heated argument. "They deserve to be treated with dignity. They are property, Margaret, valuable property, but property nonetheless." "No," she replied, thinking of Samuel's gentle hands and Rosa's knowing smile.